Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really had a strange thing happen to me this morning. I woke up in the Jimmy Buffett room. When I went to sleep last night, this shirt was white. So strange things happen in this hotel. We're going to talk a little bit today about moving from compliance to learning. And hopefully we'll make this interactive and we'll chuckle a little bit because I think the best learning can be had when we're laughing. So I'll try and get some of that in here. But I have a sad story to tell, right? And the sad story to tell is what got the Forest Service in a position where they were forced to learn, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's start with this. Like I said to you before, a pilot will always tell you that they're a pilot. This is what I did, but what got me in this room? Why is a pilot in this room talking to you guys? Well, let me tell you a little story. I woke up one morning confused and dejected because I was in the Embry-Ridiculous University master's degree in systems safety, and I was hating life. And I was assigned to an accident investigation in California. And one of the guys that I like to work with there is an ergonomics specialist, and his name is Najmuddin Mishkati. In the corner of Naj's office was a book. Some of you might be familiar with it, The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. Anybody ever heard of it? Yeah, so I said, Naj, what is this? And Naj, with his perfect Persian accent says, oh, Ivan, my brother, if you want book, take book. So I did, and I opened it up. And I started reading it in the taxi cab to the airport in Los Angeles. And by the time I got to my home, we were living here in Denver, I had read the entire book. And I said, I've got to meet this guy. So I called Sidney Decker on the phone, and Sidney says, fortuitously, next week, I'm going to be in Fort Collins. Well, that's not too far away. Can we meet you up there? He says, you can do better than that. You can meet me up there and drive me and my son back down to Denver to the airport. Yeah, that's Sidney, right? So we got to meet him, and during the drive, he says to me, well, why don't you come to my master's program at Lund University? So I did. I started the master's program, I think in 2007. Jim, do you remember? I think it was 2007, wasn't it? Yeah. Started in 2007. Jim went to the first learning lab that I went to, and he says, yeah, this is a good program. He was paying the bills at the time. He was my boss. And he says, yeah, go ahead and do it. So I start the program with Sidney. I finish the program, and I was actually the first teaching assistant that Sidney assigned in the program. And one of my first students was, where's John Allspaw? John, are you here? Are you here, John? He was. Well, that figures. He ducked out on my talk. But he's one of my first graduate students. So how did I end up here? There you go. I know John. Anybody else know John? Yeah, pretty much everybody. Okay, my operational experience. I come from a place, 10 years active duty Coast Guard. In that first 10 years of active duty in the Coast Guard, I lost 2 friends in aviation accidents, in line of duty accidents. I moved from the from the Coast Guard to the Forest Service. In my first year in the Forest Service, I lost 3 friends in aviation accidents. By the time I'd been in Forest Service for the same amount of time as the Coast Guard, 10 years, I'd lost over 25 friends in line of duty deaths. Something wasn't right. So I moved into aviation safety. I was a classically trained accident investigator by the Coast Guard. So I went through the Navy accident investigation program. And the Air Force also put me through theirs to the level of board president. And I finished the USC aviation safety program. Pretty qualified as an accident investigator. Qualified enough to know this, that when I walked onto the scene, my hands were blessed by God. I had all the power, right? I had the power to determine what somebody did and to judge that as being a choice. I had the power to say that they failed to do something. I had the power to ruin people's lives. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a process that took us down a very dark road. That's what we're going to do. That's the Forest Service SEAL. And I like to use the word self-design because I don't want you to think that one size fits all, because it doesn't. You have to have an element of self-design. You can't take things plug and play off the shelf and make them immediately apply, but you can take techniques, and I'm going to show you a couple that could be applicable to your work. This is how we orchestrated organizational change. Fundamentally 3 pillars. One is the leadership pillar, that's the green one, and we talk about that in terms of national dialogues. We talk about that in terms of a safety journey that leadership asked for. And what we did with that is we began to get leadership into a mode of inquiry. Okay? The middle column is research, and that's pretty much what Jim and I were in charge of, is doing the research to make all of this happen. And the red one is changing the way we approached learning in the organization. So we had the Serious Accident Investigation Guide, which was abysmal, and we replaced that with a learning review, which we're going to talk about. Well, the specifics about it are the things that are in dark here. We're going to talk about leadership's desire. How do we create the desire in leaders to ask questions differently? Research I'm not going to talk about too much, but there will be an image that I think you guys will appreciate from the research perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about the Serious Accident Investigation Guide, and then we're going to talk about work that we did with Los Alamos National Laboratory and Todd Conklin. So while Todd was there, he created this thing called Human Performance Improvement, HPI. And we stole it. We completely stole it from him. We adapted it for the Forest Service, and two of us, Ben Iverson and myself, taught or held dialogues with 30,000 people in the Forest Service that we called HOP dialogues. And we called it Human Organization Performance. And we're going to talk just a little bit about it. I mean, just give you a taste of that. So that's what we're going to do today. Sound good? Awesome. Let's get right into it. Here's the leadership journey. This is the beginning, and this is our piece with HOP. Our leaders literally asked us, why don't our people follow the rules? Wouldn't it be simple? Well, that's my dog, right next to the sign that says no dogs at the market, please. And my dog wasn't the only one there, right? So why don't we follow the rules? Well, sometimes the rules look like this. I'd be happy to keep off the red line if I could find the red line. Or sometimes they look like this. Give me a minute, I'll figure this out. Sometimes they look like this. This is the road, by the way, from Los Alamos down to Santa Fe. And those signs are right next to one another. What do I do with that, right? And sometimes they look like this. My favorite is the self-correcting one. So that's a little taste of HOP. HOP puts us in a mode of kind of challenging our assumptions about the world. If we assume that the world works in a specific way, that will bias all of our subsequent decisions and actions. And so what we wanted to do was engage people in a dialogue around silliness like this, and we actually use a guy that puts his head in an alligator's mouth. What do you think the alligator does? Don't overthink it. Right? The alligator does what alligators do, and it bites his head, right? And so we talk about that, and we ask a very fundamental question after that little video, and that's this. Guy's name is Kenny. Fill in the blank. Kenny is. And we get things like stupid. We get things like an idiot. We get things like doing his job. And when we get that doing his job, we leverage that into a discussion. And we come to realize through that discussion that every one of us is a Kenny. Every one of us. Now I'm going to tell you a story. This story, I may get choked up because this story is real and it happened and I was directly involved. This airplane crashed while I was at a Lund Learning Lab and my phone rang and I heard that Tanker 9 went down. I'm going to talk about 26.9 seconds and it's just the cockpit voice recording. And what I want you to appreciate about this 26.9 seconds is I want you to imagine what was going on inside the cockpit as this happened. So CVR, cockpit voice recorder, indicated that the co-pilot said, "Whoa," followed by the sound of heavy breathing. 5 seconds later, CVR indicated captain said, "We got a fire over here, a big old fire," and I can hear Gene's voice. Again, 5 seconds later, co-pilot said, "I'm holding full right aileron." Then, just a few seconds later, the CVR indicated the captain made the sound of heavy breathing. Again, a few seconds later, the captain made the sound of heavy breathing. The CVR indicated the sound of impact. End of recording. 26.9 seconds. Now, there are a number of ways that we could tell this story. This airplane is a little older, let's be frank, and it has a couple of different components. It has a big round motor, that big thing. And round motors are notorious for two things. Not for putting out power, they're not notorious for that. They do that, but that's a byproduct of burning oil and spitting oil and lots of flame. Okay, so there's a source of ignition that comes off of these engines all the time. The other little thing that other little thing is a jet engine, and the jet engine, that one, is burning avgas. Aviation gas is very highly volatile. It's not like jet fuel. It's much more volatile. So what happens to one of those engines, actually the one on the other side of the airplane, is that it experiences a turbine chunk failure. So a big piece of the turbine comes off of the engine, and it goes through the wing. Anybody know what we keep in the wings of the airplanes? Fuel, right? So when it punctures the tank, fuel comes streaming out. And with that big round motor, source of ignition, it's natural what happens next. That fuel catches on fire. Thus, big old fire, right? So Gene knew that there was a problem. They're trying to make sense of what they have because now they've got full right aileron and they're trying to control the airplane. But what do we find at the accident site? From the site that the turbine failure took place and the fire began, we see components of that wing coming off the airplane, melting off the airplane from the fire. That's one way to tell the story. But the Serious Accident Investigation Guide, it mandated that we tell the story a very different way. The way it mandated that we tell the story is like this. Oops. The probable cause, the failure of the flight crew to maintain airspeed above in-flight minimum control speed after losing power in the left engine during initial climb after takeoff. Contributing to the accident was the crew's inadequate cockpit resource management procedures, the failure of the captain to assume command of the airplane during the emergency, the flight crew's failure to carry out the jet engine fire emergency procedure, and the failure of the crew to jettison the retardant load. Wow. Wow. The community was pissed. They hated this report. Can you see why? I mean, instantly, right? What could they have done in that 26.9 seconds that addresses all of this? They were busy making sense of what they had. I'm holding full right aileron. Nothing's happening because the wing's melting off the airplane. But that's not counted here. This blames the pilots for their own death. And this was happening across the board in our investigations. And mainly it was happening across the board because of this line in the Serious Accident Investigation Guide. And it says very simply, the causes of most accidents and incidents are the results of failures to observe established policies, procedures, and controls. Well, as an investigator, I see that in my guide. I don't even need to go to the accident site. I just copy and paste that. My causal factor's right there. I don't know why it keeps doing that. So, what's happening inside the organization is this. People are not talking. They stop talking. They stop talking with each other, and they stop talking to investigators, and they stop talking to leadership. And I've said this for a really long time. Information is the currency of safety. So if we cut off our source of information, we have crippled our safety program. Anybody heard about American Airlines Flight 104 and Delta Airlines? So Delta Airlines is taking the active runway for takeoff. They're cleared for takeoff. And American Airlines 104 taxis across the runway right in front of them. Delta slams on the brakes. They reject the takeoff. They stop 1,000 feet short of impact. So pretty good clearance. And American continues to taxi to the end of the taxiway for another runway to take off and fly to London, which they do. American Airlines is now asked to supply their pilots to the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board. What do the pilots say? We're not going to do it. We're not going. So now what do you do as an investigator? Well, if you're the NTSB, and I think this may be a problem, they pull out their badge, which they have, and they subpoena these guys to come. And the Airline Pilots Association, the union, says no. And they're in a battle right now over how this is going to shake out. What that tells me is more about the system and how the pilots feel about the NTSB than it does about the pilots themselves. And that's the kind of question we need to ask. If people aren't willing to give you information, it's probably something you're doing. So what happened in our organization is firefighters stopped taking leadership assignments. They just simply stopped doing it. I'm not going to take a leadership assignment. Turning over my credentials to fight fire. They stopped talking. They stopped talking to the agency, and they stopped talking even with each other. Fear began to dominate our culture. When I would ask people what they got out of a certain accident, they'd pull out their wallets and they'd say, I got my lawyer's business card in my billfold. That's where they went. And learning shifted to how they could defend themselves and defend themselves against the agency. This is what we call a crisis of trust. And this happens through mismanagement of information that you get through the investigative processes. In fact, just the word investigation is kind of annoying, isn't it? If you hear that you're being investigated, does that give you a warm fuzzy? Bothers me, I don't like it. And we had a lot of practice. We had a hell of a lot of practice. We were losing a lot of firefighters. We got really, really good at burying people. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about how we started to shift our thinking. We shifted our thinking around understanding what a complex system is. And a lot of you probably already know what a complex system is, but bear with me for a second because I'm going to talk about everything below the blue line first. Below the blue line, we have things like simple and complicated systems. And what I want to say about this is simple and complicated systems are remarkably seductive. And the reason that they're so seductive is because they produce clear answers because the cause and effect relationship exists. And that's super important. So this is where root cause analysis actually works. I'm not going to completely denigrate root cause analysis. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say it's not really good above the blue line when we get into complex systems. And now I'm going to explain why. If we look at simple systems, their components in simple system are interconnected and interactive. Pretty simple, like a mechanical watch, interactive and interconnected. It's really easy to take that system apart, find out what failed, and this is one place where the word failure actually works, and replace that broken component, put it all back together again, and you can assume that it'll work again, it'll run again. Okay? If we go up to complicated systems, the word that we add to a complicated system to describe it is the word diverse. And we think here about nested subsystems. So systems within systems, multiple defenses, defenses in depth. This is another place where cause and effect exists, but for every cause, there are a multiple of effects that could result, limited only by the redundancy built into the system. Make sense? With me so far? Because now we're going to go over that blue wall. Okay, jumping over the blue wall, we add the word adaptive. Now, what does adaptive mean to you? When you hear the word adaptive, what does it mean to you? Say it louder. Change. Good. What else? Say it again. Senses and environment. Good. What else? New direction. Good. Excellent. What's required to get a new direction? Anybody play video games? If I don't see a hand go up, I know you guys are sleeping out there, right? So the first time you play the video game, right, you run through it, you hit some barrier that you can't overcome, and you die, you lose a life or whatever. You come back into the game again, and what happens? And now you've learned something about what the game is delivering, right? That's learning, that's adaptation. So if we equate adaptation to learning, what we see is once we get into a complex world, that's the world where humans are. It's organic, and it doesn't work to take that world apart, because when we take that world apart and we look at components in isolation, we can't see the relationship that those components have to one another, and that's hugely important, right? So these are organic systems. That's very important to hold on to, and what that means is that we have to have a completely different approach to how we look at complex systems, and that's what we learned. Now, we don't throw out the old stuff. I mean, we're working with some mechanical things, right, like airplanes. So we don't throw out the mechanical analysis, but what we add sense-making. And we add a sense-making component. And that sense-making component is designed to answer one question that Sidney Dekker asked. And that question is, why did it make sense for the people to do what they did? And that's huge. So that's what we design our system for. That's what the learning review is designed to do. You guys with me? Cool. All right. So safer systems, what we began to realize, result from the creation of margin and capacities. So I'm going to ask another question, and if I don't see a hand, I know you're sleeping again. Has anybody ever made a mistake? Okay, like today? Yeah, right? So mistakes are normal, right? Sidney Dekker says to err or not to err is not a choice. That's an important thing to hold on to. But James Reason gave us another thing. He said that when we look at individual actions, when we look at what they're doing, we can use this epidemiological model, the holes in the Swiss cheese model. And that's what he suggested that we do. But there's problems with it. And what he said is this. He said very frankly, what we need to do is think about it very, very differently. So we cannot change, quote from Reason, we cannot change the human condition, but we can change the conditions under which humans work. Then he wrote his first 2 books and forgot all about that. Because nothing that's been created in terms of accident investigation has focused on those conditions until the learning review. So here are some of the people that helped us with the learning review. The guy in the upper right, Carl Weick, a very good friend of mine. This guy right here just passed away. That's Edgar Schein. That's Todd Conklin, Sidney Dekker, and one of my great heroes who helped me really understand complex systems, Reuben McDaniel. And then there's a guy in the middle. You guys recognize this guy? Yes, we took him ziplining, and he's not forgiven us. He didn't speak to us for 2 years after this. I don't know why. Maybe you can ask him. He's in the room. Okay. Let's think about why workers do the things that they do. Let's kind of put this in a little context. The girl on the ladder here is standing in a stairwell with 1 foot on a ladder and 1 foot on a door that's not secured. OSHA would have my butt, right? But what is she doing? Did she feel unsafe? And oh, by the way, would you like to meet the girl on the ladder? She's my wife. She's sitting right there. Did you feel unsafe? No. Were you getting the job done? Yeah. And no paint any place up. Sorry? You delayed me because you said, wait. Yeah. I did. I said, don't move while I went to get the camera. Oh my God, that was terrible. Yeah, but what she's doing is she's balancing operational trade-offs, and that's what we actually pay our workers to do. That's what they're there to do, is balance these operational trade-offs. To take the rules and apply them to a complex system. That's what she did. And she didn't get any paint where she didn't want it. And she did get the paint where she did want it. So I'll just keep on going. So that's what we have to think about as our workers. Our workers are well-intended. They're trying to do the right thing in a complex environment that's constantly sending them curveballs, right? And they're negotiating that morass. They're working their way through those problems. And they're coming up with innovations, with solutions that sometimes scare the ever-loving pants off us. All right. But in our effort to understand what they're doing, we kind of have a choice. As the people that review these incidents. We could go dispositional. We could say that they're bad workers that do bad things, and we should probably fire them, right? And if we do that, we leave a void in our system. We usually get rid of expertise, and we can almost guarantee that the next person that's placed in that situation will ultimately drift to the same exact failure, right? Or we can think about things as systems driven. We can start to think about situational disposition. Situational attribution. And when we think about situational attribution, we move into that space that Reason was talking about, those conditions. That's what we need to focus on. And what we think about is not conditions that are causal. We think about conditions that influence. And that's super important because if you think about cause, you have to prove cause. But if you think about influence, you can now have a discussion. You can talk about the things that influence you. And this is really important. As we think about what got us to this place, one of the big things that got us to this place was I was sitting in a pilot ready room waiting for my turn to fly as a lead plane pilot for the Forest Service. And this tanker pilot walks in the door. And the tanker pilot says this, I just made the house payment. And I went, huh? How are these guys getting paid that that's the response that he makes? How are they getting paid? And what I found out is that not only are they getting paid by the minute, but the company that owns the airplane is getting paid by the minute of operation. What kind of things do you think that incentivizes? Right? First of all, nobody's going to say a bad thing about any kind of flight conditions out there because nobody wants to shut down the operation. So what you would get, not positive feedback, what you'd get from the pilots out there is, hey pup, my nickname, sure is a little bumpy out here. Kind of a veiled way of saying, this is frickin' dangerous. I don't want to do this anymore. But they'd never say that. Or this is impractical. They'd never say that. Instead, it's a little bumpy out here because they never would want to shut down the operation. The other thing we would get from certain operators is maybe they'd take a little longer time to get to the fire. Maybe they'd take a little longer time to get back, right? Or maybe they'd line up for a drop and say, oh, I don't think this looks great. So they'd go around for another drop. All of these things were interfering with the operation and increasing the risk exposure for the pilots. All because of one influence, and that influence was the way they were being paid. So that opened up our eyes to the problem. Now we had to figure out how to address it. So what did we do? We recognized this thing from culture. Ed Schein really helped us out with this a great deal. He said, you know, a lot of organizations push on the artifact level of culture, what we see. And so I came up with this image, and the image is of a buoy. And the buoy is tethered to an anchor. And you push the top of the buoy and it moves, and as soon as you stop pushing it, what does it do? It comes right back over the anchor again, right? So if you want to change culture in an organization, if you think about that anchor as deep assumptions that tether the artifacts, you've got to move those deep assumptions, which is also called generative learning. Ooh, I think we might be onto something. So we wanted to move toward that. We wanted to move toward that learning space and move the anchor in a positive direction. We started not with rules and not with procedures, but with principles. And what we recognized is that principle-based safety takes us a lot farther than rules-based safety. And so one of our first rules was do no further harm to the system or the people within the system. That sounds pretty darn good, doesn't it? I want to live there. That's a happy place. Learning can only take place in humble inquiry and critical reflection, which means that we have to invest as organizations in building that time for reflections. Now, we have opportunities to learn in any organization. Those are pre-mission, during mission, and post-mission. And I can tell you right now, we don't take advantage of those three. We could maximize our opportunity to learn by taking advantage of those three opportunities, but as organizations go, we don't take advantage of it. Now, when I flew for the Air Force and the Coast Guard, we debriefed every time we flew. We pre-briefed every time we flew. And we had discussions as a crew while we were flying, and those were learning opportunities. So we did that in those organizations, but the organizations built the capacity into the workforce for that to happen. Most organizations don't invest in that. One of our biggest questions after action that yielded the most return was what surprised us? Where were we surprised? That gleaned the most response and the most learning opportunity in a post-mission brief. So that was really important. Our people are good and well-intended and working in a system that is perfectly designed to deliver what it does. Right? That moves us out of that dispositional and into that situational space. That's what these principles were designed to do. Okay, so what does the learning review look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like a flowy river, as it should. It starts out with the incident, because they almost always do, except we started to apply this to normal work as well. And this is an important segue that we're going to take in just a minute. But one of the things we had to do was collect information. And what we understood in information collection was that people don't remember things like a video camera. In fact, they have their own perceptions of reality, and you know what? That's their story. And that story belongs to them, and we shouldn't change it. As an investigator trained in the classical way that I was, you remember these hands are blessed by God, that one? I had the power to change their story. I would change their story in that role to fit my model of what happened. That's no longer what happened. It's now fiction. And usually that fiction has a beginning, middle, and an end, which, by the way, real life doesn't have, okay? So we didn't want to do that anymore. What we wanted to do is develop what we call a complex narrative. And a complex narrative appreciates that different people have different perceptions of reality, and one of the most important things might be to understand what their perceptions were and see if they understood that somebody else had a different perspective, see if there was somebody there, that some way that they could share that information and recognize that they had a different perception, understand if that existed or not. And that would move us into a different place. So that's the complex narrative. Multiple perspectives captured. And here's the thing. We would take down their perspectives, we'd write it up, and we'd give it back to them and ask them, did we get it right? Did we get it right? Because the last thing I wanted to do as an investigator was put out a report and have it go out to the street and have the first person read it and go, well, that's not what happened. My story's not captured here. And that happened a lot in our investigations. We would gather the physical information. We'd do all that kind of stuff for the mechanical analysis, no question. We still did all that stuff. But then we started to figure out a way to put the decisions and actions in context. And that's where we used network mapping, which is what we're going to talk about next. So the conditions that influence decisions and actions can be multifaceted. They can involve goal conflicts. They can involve culture, social pressures, conditions that we don't even know about until we start asking questions. They could be physical or mental. They can also be training and experience. We want to capture all of that. And we want to capture that by asking very open questions about conditions. So we might not ask them what they did. We might ask them what they felt. How did they feel pressured inside the system? Once we create a map of this, we've got a bunch of choices of what we can do with it, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But here's what the maps look like. I know it's going to be hard to read. It's kind of fuzzy, right? And the next one's going to be even fuzzier. But this one's about the transportation of laptops containing personally identifiable information. Our organization wanted to fire this guy because his laptop, his government-issued laptop, was stolen out of his vehicle. In Albuquerque, it's kind of a high-crime area, but that's aside. But let's talk about this employee, and I'm going to let you guys judge if it's a good employee or a bad employee, okay? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about this guy who's going home for knee surgery. He is one deep in his position. He's the only person in the Forest Service who can approve other people so that they can approve time and attendance, so people can get paid. Pretty important job? Yeah. He felt it was super important. So on his convalescent leave, he chose to continue to do his job. He didn't have to. He chose to do it. But in order to do that, he had to download the database of all the Forest Service employees to his laptop. Now, the hard drive was encrypted. You guys know more about this stuff than I do. Had to have a common access card in order to activate the computer. Had to have a password on top of that. Pretty protected? Yeah, right? Data loss? Probably not high-risk data loss. But the Forest Service decided in their infinite wisdom that they needed to fire this guy because there was an obscure rule in HR that says you cannot be physically separated from your laptop. So what does that mean? I have to have it like inserted inside me? Right? So I'm sitting there with a bunch of senior leaders in Washington, D.C., and we're debating about this thing. And I look around the room and I see these senior leaders, and 3 of them don't have their laptops. And so I go, where's your laptop? Well, it's on a desk downstairs. Well, that's probably pretty safe. It's in a Forest Service building, pretty secure place. Where's yours? Well, it's in the trunk of my car. Where's yours? It's in my hotel room. So let's see. You're going to be okay because it's downstairs. You 2 guys are fired. How do you feel? Because you're in violation of the sacrosanct rule. But here's the better part. I go to the Albuquerque Service Center where this thing takes place, and I start to talk with the people that do this work. And I get into the elevator, and there inside the elevator, right, placarded in the back wall is how to transport laptops containing personally identifiable information. And I thought, this is brilliant. This is great. I take a snapshot of that. We go to HR and say, here's a rule. I'll take your rule and trump you with another rule, right? Rules that are not rules that are in conflict with one another. But what we started to realize about this guy was that he was a really good guy, and that he had a strong sense of customer service. He wanted to get the work done. He also had a bunch of things that were conflicting with this, a lot of goal conflicts. And so what we did was we mapped all of them, and that's what they all represent. One of the things that we came up with was an actual physical fix, having a database that's accessible off-site to people who are off-site through a VPN. And that's what we ended up setting up, finally, so that people could do work remotely. And thank goodness we did it before COVID hit. By the way, Big learning out of COVID, right? That you guys already knew in your community that the rest of the world didn't come up with until much later. People are much more creative in sweatpants. Right? So this guy really did a good job. He really helped us to highlight things. But he also pointed out how we were one deep in our protection system and one deep in our ability to do this work. And that was the problem. That was really at the core of this, right? And that we could do things that could mitigate this problem. But we could also do things that would recognize the good work that these people are doing. And the only way we were able to do that was to create this map. Now, when we talk about this from a tactical framework, we want to think about how we define situational awareness. Situational awareness is something that's really, really hinky. I mean, it's poorly defined in almost every place that we go. I mean, how many of you are omnipotent because I want to meet you, and I want to stay in your corner like forever because you're God, right? But nobody's omnipotent, right? Nobody has the ability to see everything that's happening inside their system. That's impossible. That's why we have things like local rationality and the understanding of how people are locally rational. It's because nobody's omnipotent. So this idea that Micah Ensley puts out there about situational awareness is a dream. Not all dreams are bad, but this one's kind of unrealistic, right? So what we decided to do was say, one of the things that'll help you to be situationally aware is if you understand what pressures are on you in real time. So when we create one of these maps, what we do is we immediately go to people that do the kind of work and ask them to validate the map by saying, does this exist in a normal work environment? And when we see that it exists in a normal work environment, then we've got something that we can address. And we can address it 4 ways. For the linear people in our organization, we can put it into lists, into columns. The first column is things that are outside our control, that we need to be aware of as pressures inside the system. This might be something that belongs to the regulator or belongs to even law. If you're working for the public, you're going to have laws that dictate this. So you want to understand what those pressures are so that we can make the workforce more aware of them. We may not be able to change them. The second column is things that we want to change, but it's going to be long-term. Think cultural, okay? Cultural change. And that's something we're going to want to think about, how we're going to approach those cultural changes. The next column is going to be things that we can fix right away. In this case, creating that database that was accessible through VPN offsite. A quick fix that'll actually work. And the last category, again, things that we probably don't want to change because we don't know how badly that might affect the system, but we want our workforce to be aware, thus changing the definition of situational awareness. Some of the maps are a little messier than others. Okay, this one is on the Herald of Free Enterprise, which was the largest maritime accident after Titanic. Okay. This one's pretty amazing. I mean, this is a pretty cool, and this was done by our students after a couple of weeks exposure to our course. Our students actually created this HOFE map. And I know you can't read it, but just understand that what it points out are the interconnections. And this methodology allows us to see those interconnections, the relationships of one factor, one influencing factor to another influencing factor. And if influencing factors doesn't get it for you, think performance shaping factors. Things that shape our performance. Okay, so what did we do? Well, there's a couple things we had to know how it was working. One way that we knew that it was working was the language inside our organization changed. It changed radically. But another thing, a real tangible thing that happened, was we stopped getting sued by families. So we could guarantee if we had a fatality in the Forest Service, we were going to get a lawsuit from the family. Because does anybody like to hear that their loved one contributed to their own death or caused their own death? No. What they want to hear, and almost unilaterally the family said this, we want to hear how we can learn from this so it'll never happen again. And that's what we provided to the families. We stopped getting sued. Since we put the learning review in place, we have not been sued by a family. The other thing that happened is, I mentioned this other 4-letter word, OSHA. You guys are familiar, right? OSHA would come and they would cite us for the general duty clause, which reads something along the lines of, the employer is responsible for creating a workplace free from known hazards. What do we do in the Forest Service? Right? Hazard pay. We pay them hazard. We go into the fire. We go into the forest. There is no zero risk option. We cannot create a place free from known hazard. It's impossible. So every time we'd get cited for the general duty clause. So what did we do? We didn't fight OSHA. That's silly. We asked them to come along and see what we were doing. And since they came along to see what we were doing, they actually modified their accident investigation guide for employers. You can look it up. It's a new one. And they've included quotes from Sidney Dekker. They've included the philosophy that we shared with them during the learning reviews. Now, did they go all the way? No, because they end it with root cause analysis. Oh, damn, we were so close. So there's the regulator. The next thing is field personnel. When we would go to an accident after we started the learning review, they would come out of the woodwork to try and tell their stories, right? Because they knew it was their story. And finally, we started to recognize that leaders are learners too. So as opposed to creating a report that was supposed to do everything, we started creating learning products. And the learning products were specifically designed for different audiences. And we would develop learning products for leadership specifically, bring them into the room. Little things like leaders are learners too, right? And we'd bring them into the room and start discussions with them. And what the organization did on their own, the leadership took up a mantle, and the mantle that they took up was to start national dialogues. Now, the first national dialogue wasn't great. The first national dialogue was, I'm going to tell you my sad story of when I was involved in an accident. I'm going to feel really bad, and then I'm going to say, agree to follow these rules. Coercive. Still stuck on that rules model, right? That's where they started. Well, my little group was in charge of taking all the exit interviews and feeding the information back to leadership and saying, here's what it looks like, folks. It doesn't look pretty. And so the next one was not coercive. It was a little bit more communicative, where they began to ask questions. But the final one was actually collaborative. And so it takes time for leaders to move through this. And you have to give them time, because you've got to understand that while we have that network of influences around us, they have a network of influences around them too. And you've got to appreciate that. And what's good for them is good for the field, and vice versa. So you've got to put them in that place. In fact, the biggest argument that I ever had with Sidney Dekker was a toe-to-toe knockdown drag-out over British Petroleum's Deepwater Horizon accident. And I'd been asked to be part of the presidential panel on Deepwater Horizon, and I was there for this. And I listened to what was going on, and it was super easy to blame the leadership at BP for this. Super easy. And that's where Sidney was, and I'm like, are you out of your mind? If the stuff that you're preaching about understanding human error applies to the field, it's got to apply to leadership as well. After the knockdown, drag-out fight, he turned to my wife, who was there as a guest, and said, why don't you join the master's program at Lund? Right? So Sidney got it. He came around. He really did get it. But it was an interesting conversation. And I can understand why he was in the space he was. Because often we find ourselves in an adversarial relationship with leadership. We don't need to have an adversarial relationship with leadership. We need to understand that they have influences too, and start to use some of the same logic to understand their position in the world. That's what we were talking about. That's my contact information. And if you want to link in with me, you can do that too. I think we've got time for just a couple questions.